Imagine that you're already used to having people around you hate you, yet your life began to be in danger the moment this feeling escalated into attempts to end it. While facing this madness, you end up meeting a self-centered man who, incredible as it may seem, will be the one to save your life, but he hides a secret that will completely change the meaning of things. I'm Nina, and in today's recap we will watch My Demon. The story opens with us meeting Gu-won, who is actually the devil who has been working on the planet for 200 years in this area. He has spent this time signing contracts with desperate and lonely humans, granting their wishes for 10 years in exchange for them going to a place worse than hell when the time is up. In the next scene, we meet our protagonist, a CEO who is gaining great prominence and growing more and more in this environment, creating many enemies and the envy of the people around her. Madame Ju is like a mother to Do-hee and is at all costs making appointments for the woman to find a man who wants to get married soon, in exchange for taking tests to look after her health. As neither of them like what they're doing, these terms have become fair. So the protagonist is on her way to a date, which she intends to keep to a maximum of 30 minutes, and Madame Ju is carrying out a series of tests at the same time. Back just before the meeting, we see Gu-won going to collect one of the contracts that have expired, and the man doesn't want to go as he had agreed with the devil, but there's no way to make a new contract or anything, so in the end, the man ends up losing his life and one of his guards notices that Gu-won might have been responsible. Now back to the protagonist, she arrives at the appointed restaurant and at the door already receives a warning from the employee that a man has reserved the place just for him, so Do-hee begins to think that this has happened because it is her birthday and explains that she is there to meet a man. The woman is taken to this man's table, who is none other than Gu-won. Although she thinks he's self-centered, the protagonist can't deny that the man is a cat and, in order to keep her end of the bargain, she puts him on her cell phone to wake her up in 30 minutes. During the conversation between the two, who can't stand each other, Gu-won understands that Do-hee was sent by God, because at one point the woman said that someone from above ordered her to go on the date and that she couldn't go against the words of the Almighty, which is the nickname Madame Ju earned from the protagonist. That said, Gu-won and she exchange their cards with their details, as the man is interested in knowing who the woman is. In this way, Do-hee discovers that he owns a foundation that supports traditional artists and puts on successful performances. As Gu-won is still trying to understand this situation, the woman explains to him what a blind date means, at which point he asks her why God Almighty did it. And that's when the protagonist clarifies that it was Madame Ju who was responsible, not who he thought it was, and this causes the man to laugh heartily. Soon the alarm clock goes off, telling Do-hee that she can go now, so she says goodbye and soon after she gets up, some men appear. They were working as guards for the man that Gu-won went to seek his soul, because they were there to settle a score. They go out pushing everyone who is in their way, so the employee who was bringing a cake to Gu-won's table ends up being hit and the food flies towards the woman. Do-hee is saved from being hit in the face by Gu-won, but then goes to the bathroom to get herself together. Meanwhile, the men start a fight against Gu-won and they only manage to put him out of his misery when they destroy the cake that the man had set aside some time ago. Having said that, Gu-won used his powers and arrested everyone who was disturbing his peace in the newspaper he was reading, while Do-hee in the bathroom started talking to herself about whether that cake that had almost hit her was for her birthday and getting excited about the idea. She even touched up her makeup. When she returns to Gu-won, the protagonist realizes that her supposed cake has been destroyed and leaves after the man tells her that it wasn't for her, because the woman's birthday means nothing to him, and so ends the blind date that was a disaster from start to finish. In the next scene we see that Do-hee is part of the Myri Group, a company far above the rest, one of the 10 best in Korea, which is currently in civil war, and the director, the person responsible for creating it, is Madame Ju. Next we see this lady's family, all of whom come together with her for one reason only, inheritance and power. She knows the character of each of her children and their respective families. Around her there is also her nephew and Do-hee, who is not a blood relative of these bloodsuckers. The two are the closest thing Madame Ju has to a relationship without interests. Although the relationship with her nephew is more about business and cold most of the time, she trusts him a lot. The protagonist knows that the heirs see her as a virus, but instead of being hostile, they smile and use this as a weapon. Everyone who is of the family's blood is in this civil war to find out who will take over the Myri group and take over from Madame Zhu. Returning to Do-hee in the car, she receives a call from the chief financial officer of the Myri group, and the man wants to give her some very important information, which could even make her president of the company. However, apparently the protagonist doesn't want to be dragged into this fight and in the end ends up dropping the call. Next, Madame Zhu sends Do-hee a message saying that she will leave this world first and that she will meet her in heaven, which results in the protagonist changing the route of her appointments and going to the hospital to find out if the lady is all right. When Do-hee arrives, she finds Madame Zhu with her eyes closed, and in the midst of her despair, the protagonist takes her hand and starts to cry, but the lady opens her eyes and jokes about the prank she has just pulled. Soon after, Madame Zhu appears with a cake and leaves it on her bed to surprise her brat, which is the affectionate way she calls Do-hee. Apparently the protagonist doesn't like celebrating her birthday, but Madame Zhu has always done it for her. While the two of them talk about how their date went, Do-hee discovers that her date was with the wrong person, as Madame Zhu shows her the photo of the man she was supposed to meet, and it's nothing like Gu-won. Her secretary appears and tells her that she has just learned that the person in charge at the dating agency sent her to the wrong place, which makes the protagonist very ashamed of the way she acted towards him and explains why he didn't understand what was going on. Do-hee's secretary then calls Gu-won on the number on the card he gave her and tells him that to make up for the mess, the company would like to buy him lunch, but the man refuses, saying he doesn't need it, and hangs up. Madame Zhu then takes out her cell phone and starts looking at it to make another appointment for the protagonist, but Do-hee asks her not to do this and says that if the lady wants a wedding so badly, Madame Zhu should do it herself. Then the lady tries to explain to her that it's important for Do-hee to have someone she can trust, despite having spent her whole life telling the girl that she couldn't trust anyone. But Madame Zhu comments that the protagonist will know who that person is, because even when she betrays her, you'll think that she must have had a reason and apologize. Do-hee doesn't believe that there could be someone like that, and Madame Zhu surprises her by saying that the protagonist is that person for her. Then Madame Zhu takes out a box containing 2 rings and tells Do-hee to wear them until she finds someone who deserves one of the pair. She also asks the protagonist to start celebrating her birthday and stop thinking that it's the anniversary of her parents' death. After leaving the hospital, Do-hee will drive herself to another place, as she has dismissed her secretary for the day. In the next scene, we see that the head of the financial sector who had called the protagonist has been attacked in the company bathroom by a mysterious person who has a mark on the back of his neck. Then the scene cuts to Gu-won at his company, and he faces a competition between the star Jean and his butler to find out which human the demon likes best. It's worth noting in this part that star Jean has been in love with Gu-won for a long time, but he doesn't seem to have the same feelings for her. The only thing the demon seems to have an appreciation for is his powers and the peace he feels living this way for the last 200 years, wishing it would never end. Returning to the protagonist, she was going to meet Suan, Madame Zhu's daughter, at a hotel, but when she arrived at the place, the woman had already left. Do-hee is after her because he found out that she was responsible for a leak in the press and wants to put her against the wall for it. So as not to miss the trip, Do-hee took the opportunity to go to the nearby beach, and this reminded her of a memory with her parents. The protagonist buys a drink to drink while sitting on the sand, and when it's past midnight, she sighs in gratitude that her cursed birthday is finally over. Then a man approaches asking if Do-hee has called a driver, and, as the woman has indeed done so, she believes it to be him and gets into the car. However, on the way, when the protagonist went to check her cell phone, she realized that the driver she had called hadn't even changed his location in the app, so everything indicated that this man wasn't the right person she was expecting. Do-hee noticed that there was a mark on the back of his neck, the same as the one we saw on the person who attacked the chief financial officer, and the woman, despite being frightened, confronted him, asking who was responsible for sending him to her. At that moment, The man stops the car and says that Do-hee asked the wrong question, that she should ask him why she lost her life, and already answering her, going to attack her. The man says it's all because of Madame Ju. Fighting hard to escape, at one point the protagonist managed to get out of the car and running through the fog, she came across Gu-won coming towards her. The man was there because earlier he had been looking for a human for his next contract and had managed to locate Do-hee because of the desperation she was feeling at the moment. As much as the protagonist suspected that the man who was stalking her might be in cahoots with Gu-won, she made the risky choice of going to him for help and, in the midst of her desperation, agreed to sign a contract with him. However, before the signature scam with her blood takes place, Gu-won says that he's going to put an end to the stalker because he didn't like him. While the man is doing this, Do-hee runs to the car and before he can start it, he is startled by the stalker's body being thrown onto the vehicle. Before Gu-won could get into the driver's seat, the woman got out of the car and tried to hide in that protection that is there to prevent vehicles from plummeting, but the man ended up finding her in the same way, and when Gu-won held out his hand to Do-hee, the stalker got into the car, started it up and drove towards the two of them. The demon even tried to stop the vehicle, but his powers seemed to have stopped working and the result was the two of them falling into the sea, which was better than being crushed by the car. In the water, the protagonist tried to pull the unconscious Gu-won up, but he lost his strength and fell unconscious too, at which point the tattoo that was on the man went to her. In the next scene, we see that the two of them have made it to the surface, but Gu-won doesn't understand why his powers have disappeared and why they are now with Do-hee. He even tries to ask her what she did, but the protagonist then faints. When she wakes up, she's in a hospital room and her secretary is with her, along with Gu-won. After the secretary leaves the room, Gu-won tells her that he gave the police a description of the man who tried to take their lives, which is very detailed, and tells her why he's been there until now, which is because of the tattoo. It's only at this point that Do-hee realizes what's on her wrist and she doesn't like what she sees. The woman even says she's going to try to remove it, but Gu-won asks her not to until they understand why it came off and, as the protagonist is very confused about this, she says she's going to slap the man in the face if he doesn't let her go, at which point we discover that Gu-won still has his powers, but he can only use them if he's holding Do-hee's wrist. After agreeing with the protagonist that she will not do anything against his tattoo, Gu-won goes to his foundation and there he catches his butler reading the demon manual, which is funny, as the book was in a safe. Anyway, the butler discovered that if the contracts are not fulfilled and some other things, Gu-won's body could start to combust and this will soon be the man's problem. The butler also realized that his boss is without his powers and despite being faced with this problem at the moment, Gu-won asks him to investigate Do-hee. Later, Gu-won goes to collect one of his contracts that ended that day, however things don't end up going very well without his powers to help him and the man needs to escape the place before being beaten by the students at the academy. Professional wrestling. In the next scene, we see the man who tried to take the couple's lives. He wore a mask on his face that made it look like he had a different appearance, so I believe it is not that easy for the police to locate him. The man is a bit strange and seems to have some problem with his skin, which makes him always itch and that's why he has that mark on the back of his neck. He is interrupted when the owner of the building knocks on his door wanting to know who the people are who are living there, because according to him, despite always paying on time, he is curious to get to know them and how you noticed the bloody hand of the strange man. The stranger decided to call him into the building and I believe he got rid of the owner. Returning to the protagonist who is with Madame Ju in the ladies' garden, Do-hee remembers what the stalker had told her and asks Madame Ju if she is hiding anything, but as the lady denies it, the protagonist decides to trust her. Then Madame Ju's nephew appears to show her the company reports and, as Do-hee is leaving soon, the man says he'll take the protagonist for a ride. Before they leave, Madame Ju suggests that they get married, as they both love working and have always been the best-off members of the family, but Do-hee comments that this would be very strange. In the car, It's Suk-hoon who takes the wheel, but only for a short time, as he brakes the vehicle abruptly when he hears that the protagonist has been on a blind date, which has resulted in the secretary hitting her face and her nose starting to bleed, so she takes the wheel to get them safely to their destination, while the cousins giggle in the back seats. Cutting to Gu-won, who is trying to find something about the transfer of his tattoo in the demon manual, but unfortunately there's nothing there about it. All is not lost, however, as her butler arrives with research on Do-hee, and we discover that she doesn't come from a wealthy family. Her father was one of the founders of Myri Electronics, which is the parent company of the group, along with the president, and her mother was a hairdresser who also ran a beauty salon. 17 years ago, the protagonist lost her parents in a car accident when she was just 11 years old. It was Madame Ju who took her in and looked after her until then. Although she had dated a few people, Do-hee always ended her relationships because she didn't have time for them, as her studies and work were everything to her. Returning to the protagonist, she finally manages to meet up with Suan, and to sum up their conversation, Do-hee shows the woman that she also has things she can use against her if she wants to, in the same way that Suan went after her company, and makes it clear that she doesn't want to start a war against the protagonist. In the next scene we see Madame Ju in the church confessional. She's talking about fearing something, more than going to hell, and being afraid that she, here the lady doesn't say the person's name, won't forgive her. We then see a short scene involving an accident that Madame Ju suffered. A car seems to have exploded, and with the impact she acquired knee problems, which is why she still uses a cane today. In this memory there is also a cell phone with a broken screen, receiving a call from Do-hee. Meanwhile, Gu-won's butler ends up letting it slip to Star Jean that their boss is without his powers. And speaking of the demon, he went to meet Do-hee to see if he could get his powers back. The protagonist even tried to pay him back for the disastrous lunch they had the other day, but the man just asked her to go somewhere with him. Gu-won took her to the contracts he hadn't been able to finalize earlier, and with her powers back, it was easy. Then they went to a parking lot for couples in love to do that, and he said he wanted to test something with her. Gu-won guides her out of the vehicle and they stop in front of a river. Then the man asks her if she can hold her breath, and at that moment, the protagonist thought he was going to kiss her, but Gu-won makes them both fall into the water, and at the bottom, he tries to do everything he can to get the tattoo to come back to him, but nothing works. This only makes Do-hee very angry, and she starts to fight with him, as this is the second attempt on her life in less than 48 hours, and the woman is exhausted and starts to panic. After calming down, she goes to Gu-won's vehicle to get her purse and hand over the money he hadn't accepted so that there are no more disputes between them, and the protagonist goes on her way. In the next scene we see that the stalker has put the belongings of the chief financial officer he had attacked in a package and left it in a cupboard. Then someone else has picked up the same package, and when he gets on the chief financial officer's phone, he discovers that the last person the man had called was Do-hee, and we can also see that the person who picked up the package last has a lighter in his hand. Now we see several small scenes, in one of which a man with scarred skin appears at the reception of a mental health clinic, scratching himself a lot and looking mentally unwell. Another is Suan freaking out on the phone, asking someone to publish an article and that she'll pay a lot of money for it, then promising to end Do-hee's life. The next person to appear is the protagonist crossing the street and stops when she reads the news on the big screen that the head of finance who had called her has been found dead, after which a motorcycle approaches Do-hee at high speed and tries to throw a liquid at her, but luckily Gu-won appears at that moment and protects her, so that he is the one who is hit. The man's clothes begin to dissolve and his skin will soon be burnt if the sulfuric acid hits it, but at that moment the man uses his powers by holding the protagonist's wrist, and that's when she realizes that he's no ordinary man, so Gu-won says he's a demon, which for us would be the devil. Later, they go to the police station, where the detective asks Do-hee questions about whether she has someone who is trying to take her life, and although 90% of the people around her are suspicious, the woman says no. Meanwhile, Gu-won waits outside the interrogation room and comes across a woman who lives on the streets who has been taken to the police station. This person comes up to him and says that the man is ephemeral at the moment, but that he will soon lose his life and it will be a terrible event. However, Gu-won didn't pay much attention to the woman's words and left the place feeling contempt for her. When the man is in the car with the protagonist, she can kind of understand what he is and what he does, so she decides to use this to her advantage. Since Gu-won needs her to use her powers and Do-hee's life is on the line, he can stay by her side at all times and they can pretend that the man is her bodyguard, but the demon won't accept it. For him it's an offense to use his powers to protect a mere human, so there's not much the protagonist can do. But it's a good thing that Gu-won took her home, because the stalker was waiting for the woman in the parking lot and only didn't act because the man was with him, which results in him freaking out in his hiding place because his attempts are always failing. Alone at home, Do-hee even sends messages to Gu-won saying that she'll turn his tattoo into a piggy if he doesn't agree to be her bodyguard, but this doesn't have the effect she was hoping for. Then the protagonist sees the report about the chief financial officer and decides to call Madame Ju to find out if everything is all right at the company. The woman even comments on the call she had received from the man and the lady hangs up after saying that nothing is happening to Do-hee. But back at home, Madame Ju asks her secretary for a financial summary of the parent company and its subsidiaries, along with the story about the chief financial officer, and spends the night investigating the documents. As the day begins to dawn, the lady says that she can't believe she hasn't noticed something going on, and we viewers suffer through the mystery. In the next scene we see that Gu-won's body has started to spontaneously combust, so the man forces himself to go and meet the protagonist and accept her offer to be his bodyguard, so that he can use his powers to close more contracts and stop the combustion process. So the man goes for his first contract with Do-hee by his side. He makes the proposal to the mother who has a daughter with very severe cancer, that he will save her if the woman goes to hell in 10 years' time and to help her girl. The mother says she accepts going to much worse places, so she ends up accepting. After they leave the hospital, Gu-won talks about his habit of always eating sweets after signing a contract and the protagonist begins to express the contempt she feels for his attitude of using the misfortune of others to his advantage, which really makes him a demon. Do-hee explains to him that the little girl he saved will probably feel guilty if she finds out what her mother did to save her. But Gu-won doesn't care about that, and as the protagonist doesn't agree with his means of staying alive, she says she won't use him as a bodyguard anymore. Meanwhile, Madame Ju receives a person at her house, whose face we can't see, and the woman tells him that as well as doing a dirty job, he has taken the life of another human being, so he should pay for his sins. Returning to Gu-won, he was thinking about what the protagonist had said about the girl feeling guilty if she found out, so he decided to go back to the hospital and ask her what her wish was. The girl's answer was that her parents would no longer suffer because of her, and after that, something began to change inside the demon. The protagonist also ends up meeting her family again in a restaurant. They went there to celebrate the little girl's 10th birthday and the whole situation moved Do-hee. Later, when the protagonist is back at the company, she gets out of the car and meets Gu-won and we discover that he has been rehired as a bodyguard. Later we see the two of them together and Do-hee asks the man questions to find out how he became a demon. Then we learn that he was once a human, 200 years ago, but Gu-won doesn't carry the memory of that time. The book, which is a manual on demons, says that God needed someone to work in hell and for this a human was chosen, which in this case was Gu-won. The conversation is interrupted when the protagonist receives a message from Madame Ju, who says that it's over for her and that she loves Do-hee. These words make the woman worried and the feeling increases when the lady doesn't answer her cell phone. So the two of them go to Madame Ju's house, where she is found in her garden and appears to be unconscious. The protagonist tries to get the lady to wake up, but she doesn't succeed and this begins to make Do-hee desperate. The next day, Madame Ju's wake takes place and the ceremony reminds the protagonist of when her parents died. The 11-year-old Do-hee didn't want to cry and blamed herself for their accident, because she wanted them to come and celebrate their anniversary with her. So when Madame Ju first appeared in the protagonist's life, she still didn't have this love for her, but on that day, she helped the girl understand that she should put her feelings out there and cry over her parents' death, which wasn't her fault. Returning to Doohee, the war against her began as soon as Madame Zhu was no longer with us, and everyone in the blood family began to make it clear how much they didn't want her among them, except Sukun. At one point, after seeing everyone enjoying themselves on that sad day, the protagonist decided that she couldn't go on there any longer, so she headed for the garden that had been a place of refuge for Madame Zhu. Meanwhile, the man who is chasing her is also there, but in this situation Doohee doesn't realize it. The protagonist's peace in the garden is interrupted when Sukmin's son enters the place to smoke, and Doohee warns him that Madame Zhu wouldn't like him to infest her flowers with the smoke he would produce, but Du Jiang replies that his grandmother has died and now everything will belong to his father, so he can do whatever he wants, even replace the old lady's smell that she left behind. But our protagonist won't lie down for this spoiled man. She insists that Madame Zhu wouldn't like it, and he takes her off guard when she replies that today is a good day, after which Doohee takes the cigarette out of Du Jiang's mouth and says that he won't let him do it. The man didn't seem to have a problem doing something to the protagonist, but before he could think of anything, Guwon approached the two and the spoiled man left. Guwon and Doohee share a good wine, after which the protagonist begins to talk to him about Madame Zhu. She tells him that the lady used to go to the greenhouse because it protected her from the cruelty she herself committed, and that Madame Zhu knew that her children would be happy with her gone, which is why she was always grumpy with them and kept to herself. Doohee wanted to have the opportunity to say goodbye, and Guwon grants her this little wish, because according to the man, we wear black at funerals so that the spirit of the deceased doesn't recognize the loved ones and goes into the light. But to give the protagonist some peace, he changes the color of her clothes to white and leaves her alone, and not long afterwards, a butterfly appears and lands on the protagonist's finger. Later, we see that the detective has gathered everyone together to tell them that Madame Zhu used a painkiller that she was allergic to, so he asks her if she suddenly didn't have any enemies who could have changed her medication, since the label on the bottle said another drug, but the only people who knew about the danger of the medication if she took it were those in the room and her doctor, which makes them suspects. Despite this, the lady's legitimate children decide that they will not divulge the true cause of their mother's death to the press, and this begins to disturb Doohee, as the protagonist begins to connect the dots that the audit would have been dismissed earlier, the death of the chief financial officer, and that whoever did this to Madame Zhu didn't want anything to be investigated. Somehow everything was connected. Doohee just didn't know the reason yet. The protagonist takes the decision to announce in front of everyone that Madame Zhu has been the victim of a crime, which makes her even more hated by the lady's children, and the eldest son, Sukmin, orders security to take Doohee out of the place. However, the lawyer who was about to read the will said that one of the conditions for announcing what was written was that the protagonist be present, so Doohee remained. And what the man read shocked everyone, but especially Madame Zhu's children, because she left everything, including the presidency of the company, to the protagonist, but there was one condition: she would have a year to get married, otherwise the rights would pass to Sukmin. As the lady already knew the uproar this would cause, she left a written letter for each of her heirs explaining her reasons. The protagonist then begins to be pressured not to marry by those who have always treated her badly, so in response she says that the only way to stop her is to take her own life. Deciding to put an end to the war that has only just begun, Doohee takes one of the rings she carries on her fingers and offers it to Guwon, asking him to marry her. Guwon's response to Doohee's proposal was a quick, "I don't want to," which shocked everyone, especially the protagonist herself. After this, Doohee decided to leave, and despite rejecting her, Guwon remained faithful to his job as her bodyguard. Meanwhile, Madame Zhu's children began plotting to prevent the protagonist from taking over the company. The eldest son recalled an old memory of desperately crying to his mother, claiming he was drunk and unaware of someone, while Madame Zhu spoke on the phone with someone, saying he would pay the price for his crime. Back to the protagonist, she went up to her apartment alone, venting loudly about her frustration at Guwon's rejection, thinking no one was listening. However, she had forgotten the letter Madame Zhu had written to her in his car. As Guwon came up to deliver it, he overheard everything and decided to leave quietly so she wouldn't take her anger out on him. someone else heard a bit of the protagonist's venting, Suk-hoon, who came to check on Do-hee. She confided in him about her suspicions regarding Madame Ju's death and the attempts on her life, sharing everything with the only person she considered family. Before leaving, Suk-hoon added his number as an emergency contact on Do-hee's phone, so she could call for help immediately if anything else happened. In the next scene, we see the protagonist asking to meet Gu-won. After their conversation, while he was driving her home, Do-hee fell asleep in the car, which was unusual for her. This indicated she felt safe around him. He took the opportunity to return the letters she had left behind. Upon reaching her apartment, the protagonist decided to add Gu-won's number as an emergency contact as well. As she read Madame Ju's letter, we see that in the following days, the protagonist followed the steps the lady had asked her to take. However, Madame Ju's children opposed everything, denying requests for another autopsy on their mother and even slapping Do-hee. Madame Ju's condition for Do-hee to marry was because she didn't want her to face everything alone. Madame Ju confessed she only managed to stay strong with the protagonist by her side. In the next scene, Gu-won's memories from when he was human began to return, and it seemed everyone called him Master Yi-sun. This meant that without his powers, the man was reverting to being a simple human, meaning he would soon start aging as well. At the company, the protagonist and Gu-won spent the day analyzing security camera footage from Madame Ju's house, which Do-hee's secretary had obtained. In the end, they realized they were too late, as the footage had already been edited. Suk-hoon informed the protagonist that the computers of other company victims who had lost their lives had also been wiped clean. The scene cuts to a man targeting the protagonist, who sent an anonymous tip to the gang after Gu-won, revealing his identity and location. It would now be difficult to protect her with these forces united. Back to Do-hee, Gu-won accepted an invitation from some of the protagonist's office colleagues to go drinking, and of course, he dragged her along. The two found themselves in a place they weren't accustomed to frequenting. Gu-won accepted the invitation as an opportunity to pretend that something was happening between him and Do-hee. He held her wrist under the table, causing their colleagues to suspect they were a couple. However, Gu-won ruined the night by saying something unpleasant, leading to a fight between him and the protagonist. She dismissed him from his bodyguard duties, and they walked in opposite directions down an alley. As this happened, the gang found Gu-won and began attacking him. Meanwhile, the protagonist grew worried when he didn't answer her calls and went looking for him. When Do-hee found him, he was bleeding, surrounded by the gang. She used the self-defense tools she had bought and went to Gu-won. When he grabbed her wrist, they began dancing the tango, and in a unique way, they defeated everyone targeting him. Unbeknownst to the couple, the protagonist's stalker was also present and recorded everything. When they arrived at Do-hee's building, Gu-won acted strangely and left without saying anything. The protagonist was confused, and viewers discovered that the man was beginning to develop feelings for her. The protagonist also suspected that Gu-won might be developing feelings for her, so she went to his company to clarify things. There, she met Jean, a star who had harbored feelings for the demon for a long time, yet they remained unrequited. In the end, Gu-won acted as if he was annoyed by Do-hee's presence, leading her to believe her earlier thoughts were just in her head, so she decided to return home. Meanwhile, we see Suk-min with the audit team, and he once again bought them off by threatening to expose them for corruption if they didn't side with him. His son, Do Jae-young, ended the life of the doctor treating his mental health. It seems everyone in Madame Ju's lineage is quite unconcerned about their misdeeds. The protagonist's stalker handed over the video he recorded of the two dancing the tango and defeating the gang to the person ordering these attacks against her. Although they didn't know what Gu-won was, they realized they needed to separate the two. The next day, a strange man with a helmet entered Do-hee's company. As a precaution, the protagonist's secretary hit him on the head with a folder, as he seemed very suspicious. When he fell to the ground and the helmet was removed, it turned out to be Mr. Park, Gu-won's secretary. He had dressed this way to avoid drawing attention, but it didn't work out. Later, Miss Shin apologized to Mr. Park at the protagonist's request, and we noticed that the two would have a relationship of teasing each other, even competing over who had the better boss. However, the secretary wasn't entirely wrong to hit the man, as we see that the stalker had already infiltrated Doohee's company. In the next scene, a meeting with the audit team was taking place, and an interim president was elected until Doohee married or the company was passed to Suk-min. As we saw, the eldest son had bought most of the voting members and won the vote. Later, in the protagonist's car, Suk-hoon showed her what he found suspicious about the company's financial situation. It turned out that 2 years ago, the Myri Group bought a ship from a company for a large sum of money. Surprisingly, no one knew the ship's whereabouts, and when he continued investigating, Doohee's cousin discovered that the corporation had recently closed its doors. This all pointed to a classic accounting fraud, and Suk-hoon promised to dig deeper to help the protagonist. The next step for Doohee was to find someone to marry. Since Gu-won had rejected her, she sought out the man who was supposed to be her blind date. Although he wasn't her type, he became a good option since having a prosecutor by her side would cut through many obstacles when dealing with Madame Ju's children. Doohee arranged to register her marriage with the prosecutor at the registry office in 2 hours. However, Gu-won couldn't bear to see the unhappiness on her face any longer. To help her avoid marriage, he went to the new gang leader to try to strike a deal for their assistance in catching the culprit. But things started to get out of control, and Gu-won began taking his anger out on the leader. This prompted Doohee to ask what his problem was and why he was acting this way. At that moment, the demon confessed that he had a perfect life before she appeared and that if they hadn't met that day, everything might still be fine. Thus, the protagonist decided to dismiss him once again, saying she didn't need him anymore. When she got home and was preparing for bed, Doohee heard music coming from her living room and began to suspect that her stalker might be in her house. She grabbed her self-defense tools and cautiously approached the room, but on the way, she was caught from behind and fainted. When she woke up, she was hanging from her building's balcony, and the man seemed to be enjoying the situation. He started cutting the fabric holding the protagonist, and just as Doohee began to fall, Gu-won appeared and grabbed her wrist. When the stalker grabbed her, her phone sent a message to her emergency contacts. As soon as he received the alert, Gu-won rushed to save her. Back on the balcony, the stalker hadn't left and even tried to make them both fall. However, by holding Doohee's wrist, Gu-won managed to get them to the building's emergency stairs. The protagonist couldn't say anything, only hugging him and crying. At that moment, her cousin arrived, and they all returned to Doohee's apartment. It seemed the stalker had broken the apartment's lock to get in. Since there were cameras in her residence, the protagonist accessed them via her phone. Both she and Gu-won noticed it was the same man due to marks on the back of his neck. However, his face appeared different, as if he was wearing a mask. This realization frightened Doohee even more. She realized her stalker could be anyone around her, and for the first time, she understood the fear of losing her life. Suk-hoon, as always, told the protagonist she didn't need to face any of this alone and proposed to her. But he wasn't the only one. Gu-won had a change of heart and also proposed. From having no options, she now had 3. The protagonist responded that she needed time to think. The next day, Suk-hoon went to the protagonist's company to deliver flowers and apologize for his unexpected proposal. They laughed and enjoyed themselves as usual. Outside, Gu-won watched them and seemed to feel jealous. Later, Suk-hoon confessed his feelings to Doohee, revealing what he had felt for her all this time. However, as we already know, her feelings for him were different. Later, in the car with Gu-won, she questioned why he had proposed when he had previously rejected her. He confessed that he didn't want her to lose her life. In the next scene, we see the protagonist attending an inauguration ceremony with all of Madame Ju's family present. She announced to them that she would be getting married the next day. Doohee also managed to identify her stalker among the crowd, but before she could act, he had disappeared. The next day, the big day arrived. When she was alone, Doohee got lost in her thoughts and ended up talking to Madame Ju, which brought her some comfort. We then moved to the ceremony, which was perfect. We discovered that the protagonist and Gu-won had made an agreement to achieve their goals, committing to appear as a real couple to others. Suk-hoon attended his beloved's wedding, and she explained that he was perfect for the commitment. Even though he wasn't chosen, he would always be her family. In the next scene, we see the protagonist's stalker having a breakdown in his hideout. It appeared he had attended the ceremony, as there was a photo of the newlyweds that he pinned to the wall with a knife through Gu-won's image. Returning to the couple, Gu-won moved into Doohee's house, and she discovered that his powers could be used for cleaning as well. The two began to relax and become less tense. Later, reflecting on Do Jae-young's surprise at seeing her at the inauguration ceremony and the strange smile he had at her wedding, the protagonist started to suspect that he might be involved in the attempts on her life. The next day, they began using Gu-won's powers to follow Do Jae-young. They discovered that he left his car in a part of the city to continue traveling by subway. The protagonist thought this might be his meeting point with her stalker. Indeed, Do Jae-young went to a locker where the man appeared to leave the victim's belongings. As a viewer, I think if it were him, it would be too obvious. I believe he might be involved but not the mastermind behind everything. Returning to the story, Do Jae-young noticed the people in the photo booth were watching him. As he approached, Gu-won tried to get them out, but for some reason, his powers didn't work when the flashes indicating pictures were being taken started. So, he decided to kiss Doohee to hide their faces. When Do Jae-young opened the curtain, he couldn't identify them, or at least that's what I think. Before leaving, Gu-won grabbed the photos of him and the protagonist. The two encountered a homeless woman at the station. Initially, she seemed to be rambling, but then she mentioned to Gu-won that if something was failing, it meant that after a while, it wouldn't work anymore. Doohee thought the woman might be referring to his powers, but since Gu-won said he didn't know her and they should ignore her, the protagonist simply obeyed. In the next scene, the couple follow Do Jae-young to his parents' house, but because it's too dangerous to enter the enemy's residence, the two decide to end their investigations for the day. Now we see Suk-hoon, who is going after information about the theater that Gu-won runs, and as soon as he receives some photos of the opening of the venue from years ago, the man realizes that Gu-won is in them, and now he starts to believe that the man might be something, like a vampire. Meanwhile, Gu-won has started to take various things that belong to him to the protagonist's house, since he's now going to live with her, and he thought it was right to put the essentials in the apartment, but it turns out that it's really too much stuff, and so the two end up fighting over the mess he's making, with the result that Doohee throws him out with his belongings. And as a form of protest, the man decides to stay in her car in the parking lot until she begs him to come back. Taking advantage of the fact that the man isn't there, Suk-hoon goes to the house to talk to the protagonist about what she believes she has found out from Gu-won. However, when the man shows him the photos he got and that there is Gu-won in them, Doohee explains that this was his grandfather at the time, hence the resemblance between the two, and that Suk-hoon should rest assured that there is nothing to worry about. However, the man didn't believe his beloved's words, and to try to find out more, since he feels that the couple are hiding something, Suk-hoon invites Gu-won out for a few drinks. During the conversation, Suk-hoon says that he knows Gu-won isn't human and makes the comparison to a vampire, which the offended demon denies. And although he hasn't found out about Doohee and Gu-won's secret, Suk-hoon makes it clear that if the man ever threatens the protagonist's life, Suk-hoon won't stand by and watch it happen, and promises to tell everyone what he really is. Meanwhile, the star Jin was walking through the streets of the city a little out of sorts, having had several drinks, and when the woman falls while twisting her ankle, we see the story of how she met Gu-won, since the reason she's in this state is because she found out about the man's marriage to Doohee, which made her extremely furious, as did the feeling of betrayal, even though they had nothing. When Jiayang was little, her father would take out his anger when he got drunk on the girl, and one day, the demon showed up at their house, while she was hiding from the man, to get the girl's father who had signed a contract with him years ago. Little Star Jean knew at the time that she had only survived because of Gu Won, and at the same moment came to believe that he was her guardian angel, but despite this, the demon went away and left her, but Jiayang swore to herself that she would spend her life looking for him to live by her side. Returning to the drunken Jean Star, some men began to bother her, wanting to take advantage of her situation, and after she had denied their presence more than once, Jiayang slapped one of the men in the face, which resulted in him returning the aggression. However, before he could do so, Gu Won, who was nearby, saw the scene and grabbed the man's arm, after which the group left and the demon took her home. In his office at the theater, Gu Won talks to Mr. Park about having more frequent dreams that are actually memories of his past life, and what they both come to the conclusion about is that the longer Gu Won goes without his powers, he becomes human, and as a result, his powers may be failing until they cease to exist. Gu Won thinks that this may be why he's having feelings for Do Hee, and hopes that once he gets his tattoo back, everything will return to normal. Later, when the demon is on its way to Do Hee's house, we see that the protagonist's stalker has managed to enter the theater and Gu Won's office. The man has taken the book about the demon and installed a bug under his desk. Meanwhile, Gu Won and Do Hee make up, then as the man's powers are failing, he suggests they sleep together so that he can recharge them all night, and more, our couple become one for real. The next day, the protagonist is woken up with some very bad news. A man who we can say is like an influencer on social media, is doing a live stream that has been going on for hours, talking about the subject that Do Hee is the real culprit behind Madame Ju's death. The man claims that the will was changed on the day the lady died, and that because a person who is not her blood received the entire inheritance, she can only be to blame. He adds the fact that there wasn't another autopsy before the body was cremated, but we know that the protagonist went after all this, and it was the woman's children who denied it. Do Hee knows that this is Suk Min's foul play, and so she and Gu Won teleport to the place where the man is. This feeds more and more into Suk-hoon's idea that Gu Won isn't a human, because before they went after the man, Suk-hoon had left them alone in the room and didn't see them go out the door. Now we see Do Hee going to talk to Suk Min, and the man doesn't mind confirming that he was the mastermind of the whole mess. So the protagonist talks about his relationship with Madame Ju, in which the woman always said that she gave birth to the seed of evil, and that she even tried to fix it by sending him to prison to pay for the crimes he committed, but that wasn't enough. Do Hee tells Suk Min that he believes he didn't run over a man when he was younger because he was drunk, but because of the evil inside him, and after saying these things, the man points the gun he's holding at our protagonist. Do Hee tells him to shoot, and as he takes too long, she starts to turn her back to leave, when suddenly she hears the sound of the bullet coming towards her. Gu Won runs to meet her, and we see that the man has shot her in the side of the head, just to scare her. The woman tells Suk Min that it's cowardly to shoot him in the back, and the man replies that that's how things work in war, so now Do Hee is increasingly thirsty for revenge. Now the couple goes straight to that influencer, and of course Suk Min has left no trace of being connected to the man, as he paid him in Bitcoin, so Gu Won transfers the three of them into a safe and explains that as the influencer wanted to have a lot of money and be famous, now he'll have both, but not for as long as he wants. The man can take as much money as he wants from the safe, but the next day he'll be arrested when he's found inside, and this will give him fame, but not in the way he imagined. The scene cuts and we see that the couple have gone to Gu Won's office, because Mr. Park claims that the demon's book has gone missing. While they are there looking for the object, they explain to Do Hee what the book is about, so that the stalker who bugged the place knows everything. In the next scene, we see the gang that was after Gu Won and got beaten up by him, arriving at the theater, thinking he would have to face them once again. The man is surprised when the current leader bows down to him and Gu Won is appointed their new boss. Meanwhile, the stalker has handed over the manual and the recordings to the mastermind, after which he receives the order to finish Gu-won off when the man is alone, as they have already understood that he only becomes powerful alongside Do-hee. Back at the protagonist's house, as soon as Gu-won leaves to watch the performance of the theater that will open today, she is surprised by the visit of the detective who is there to arrest her for Madame Ju's death. Gu-won then receives the news and rushes out of the theater. However, he also receives a surprise at the front of the venue when Do-hee's stalker stabs him in the heart. The man begins to lose a lot of blood and only stops suffering when Mr. Park arrives and pulls the stalker off Gu-won, at which point the mask he was wearing rips and the demon manages to see his face, but Gu-won soon faints from his injuries. As soon as the detective tells Do-hee what has just happened, he releases her to go and see him, but the woman must go and return without being seen. Meanwhile, Gu-won undergoes surgery, but unfortunately the surgeon warns Mr. Park and Star Jean that because of the blows to his heart, the organ is badly damaged and he probably won't survive. Do-hee then arrives at the hospital and goes to the room where her husband is under observation. There, the already nervous woman is greeted by Star Jean, who shouts at her saying that this is all her fault. Concerned only about saving the man, the protagonist puts her hand on his wrist, but nothing happens. Suk-hoon watches through the little window in the door and finds this reaction very strange. Back in the room, Do-hee starts crying because nothing is working and she doesn't want to lose him. As we know, the protagonist doesn't have many people around her, and for a moment, the tattoo works again, which heals half of Gu-won's wounds. Soon the man wakes up and he is still quite weak, but he asks Do-hee to hug him, and it is this vision that Suk-hoon sees from the outside, not understanding how he has improved so much in a matter of minutes. Do-hee needs to get back to the police station so that neither the detective nor she suffer any consequences. As for Gu-won's condition, we can say that before he had a 1% chance of living, now he has 50%, and as he will spend the night unconscious, the man has some strange dreams in which he is spontaneously combusting. After the 48 hours that Do-hee was detained, Gu-won has woken up and has improved a lot. The good thing is that his safety at the hospital is guaranteed, since the gang has gone to the place and are committed to protecting him. And as soon as Gu-won sees Do-hee, he seems to have improved by 90%. The man asks them to go home to be together, and the way they sleep at night, who's to say that this isn't the real couple? They're falling for each other. In fact, the next day Gu-won and Mr. Park go to the company together, because the man didn't want to be far from his beloved. And that influencer, in the end, managed to convince Gu-won not to leave him at the bank, so he revealed to everyone that he was paid to tell those lies. Now focusing on Gu-won, that dream he had in which he was having spontaneous combustion is terrifying him, and even Mr. Park has noticed it, so he takes him out of the company, and after pressing him, Gu-won tells him about what's bothering him, and his secretary becomes distressed about it too. Meanwhile, Star Jean went to Do-hee's company to talk to Gu-won, and when he didn't find him, he decided to talk to the protagonist. Jae-young tells Do-hee that she should leave Gu-won alone and stop using the tattoo as a bargaining chip, as the man almost lost his life because of her, and that the woman should deal with her own affairs on her own. As she's leaving the protagonist's office, Star Jean runs into Gu-won, so they talk, and Jae-young starts blaming Do-hee for everything that's happening, even though the man makes it clear that she has nothing to do with it. Star Jean realizes that Gu-won is falling in love with the protagonist, so he warns him that if he doesn't hold back his feelings now, he will become more and more human, and then there will be no turning back. At night, Do-hee has trouble sleeping because of the latest events and decides to have a heart-to-heart talk with Madame Ju. The protagonist is afraid of continuing in the ladies' family war and ending up losing Gu-won, so after thinking about it, Do-hee warns Suk-hoon about her decision. The next day, the company's board meeting takes place to decide who will be the new president, which I don't particularly understand. Do-hee has fulfilled all of Madame Ju's requirements. They should give her the job without even thinking about it. And before the vote begins, the protagonist announces that she is withdrawing her candidacy, which comes as a surprise to everyone present. At the end of the meeting, Do-hee tells the late lady's children that she is also going to give up the rest of her inheritance. Gu-won, I believe, is the one who is most shocked by all this information, so he questions the woman outside the building about all the decisions she has just made, and instead of the protagonist telling him about her true motives, Do-hee lies and hurts him by saying that she left the war because he was no longer able to protect her. However, Gu-won knows that Suk-hoon could be behind the protagonist's decision and goes after him to try to understand what made Do-hee change his mind. As soon as he finds him, the man discovers the real reason she gave up. He then looks for the protagonist, who is in Madame Ju's garden. As soon as he finds her, he hears her talk about her fear of losing him. Soon the two realize that Gu-won's powers are working again, so the man is completely cured of his injuries from the attack he suffered, and they go home to do that. The next day, our couple take the opportunity to go out on dates and have fun. The protagonist even learns that in the past demons were like guardians of humans and that the word has Greek origins, meaning to share a single destiny. When evening comes and they go home, in the hallway of the apartment, Do-hee's heart starts racing when she hears the same music that was playing the day she was tied up on the balcony, but she calms down when she realizes that it was the ringtone of a neighbor of hers. Gu-won doesn't want his beloved to have bad memories every time she hears this song, so when the two of them enter the house, he puts it on and invites the protagonist to dance with him. After they have relaxed, the man tells Do-hee that this will be their song. Meanwhile, Suk-min has taken his son to play golf and has decided to talk to him about what he believes is the real reason his mother hates them. The man thinks that Madame Ju was self-loathing, so she thought their blood was dirty, and because they had it, they ended up hating her. And particularly, I don't think that's the case, because it's not like the family did everything right? If something like that had come from Do-hee, we might even consider it, but these children of Madame Ju's are worthless. Returning to father and son, something curious happens in the middle of their conversation, when Suk-min receives a message. Do-jaeong, who has 2 cell phones, one also beeps, which leads me to think that he has cloned his father's phone. The next day, Gu-won tries to use his powers and once again they fail, but the man believes that he just needs to recharge more by being close to the protagonist. Later, taking advantage of the fact that he's fine and remembers his stalker's face, Gu-won decides to go to the detective to get a sketch of the man. He then prints it out on several pieces of paper and distributes it to the gang who declared him as their boss in order to find him. Taking advantage of being in the theater, Gu-won opens up to Star Jean and talks about his relationship with Do-hee, about what he's feeling for her, and makes it clear that he'll never give up on his beloved wife. He also adds that it's not for Jaeyoung to cross any more boundaries. In the next scene, we see that the protagonist and Mrs. Shin have gone out drinking to celebrate the end of the family war, but the two of them have had too much alcohol and become very silly. As a result, Gu-won had to ask Mr. Park to help him take Mrs. Shin home so that the man could deal with his wife. And the stalker received a message telling him to get rid of everything that could link him to what had happened, so the man bought gallons of gasoline, and before he started distributing them around the place where he was hiding, we saw who was telling him to do all those things. The man responsible for everything was Suk-min, who showed that he didn't care about taking the life of his loyal hound, because the man took advantage of the situation to finish him off, and when he realized what Suk-min was doing there, he locked himself in his room. Trapped there, Suk-min pours gasoline into the room and then uses his lighter to start what will end his hound's life. And as expected, we see that he was the one who switched his mother's medication, which led to her losing her life. The next day, Do-hee and Gu-won receive the news that the culprit has been found. The stalker's body was found in his hideout all burnt up, and a knife was stuck after he was no longer alive in his chest, which the demon believes is a message to him. After the meeting with the detective is over, Gu-won asks Do-hee to stay with Suk-hoon, and he goes to his foundation, where he looks for a bug and finds it under his desk. The man realizes that there is another culprit behind all this, the real mastermind. It's at this point that Gu-won realizes that the clocks he had representing the time of the contracts he had signed have stopped. This means that the man's powers have completely disappeared and those who signed their names start coming back with the problems that surrounded them, like that little girl in the hospital whose mother had signed a contract. In the midst of his despair, Gu-won remembers that the homeless woman knew something about him, so the man decides to go to her. The two end up going to an establishment to talk. There, Gu-won realizes that some people see her differently, as a woman with money. And when he complains that the place is a bit too exposed for them to have this kind of conversation, the woman starts snapping her fingers, which changes the scene. At that moment, we discover that she was responsible for giving man his powers. In other words, she is the representation of God. However, it wasn't the woman who took away our Gu-won's powers. She explains that as they are now in an unstable body, they will diminish until they disappear, just like the man who is gradually dying. The only way for the demon to regain his powers is if the protagonist loses her life by the night of the full moon, otherwise the process of Gu-won's demise begins, and there's no way to save them both from it. And at the same time, Star Jean is on a date with Suk-hoon, where she tells the man the whole truth about who Gu-won really is and what Do-hee has to do with this story. In the next scene we see Do Jae-young arriving home, and on the cell phone he has cloned from his father, he notices that some of the man's messages with his late stalker have been deleted. We now see the protagonist and she is at home with her husband. The man asks her a few questions, like if the world ended tomorrow what would she like to do, and Do-hee's answer is that she would like to spend her last day with him, with the two of them just traveling and having fun. In order to enjoy more time with his love, before disaster strikes, Gu-won invites her to stay up all night and enjoy each other's company, but while they're watching a horror movie, the protagonist ends up falling asleep. So her husband takes her to bed and the two of them start talking while she's half awake and half asleep. Gu-won tells her that he is going far away, to a place where she won't be able to visit him, and that his greatest fear is that she will disappear from this world, which is why he has decided to move away. However, when he sees a full moon in the sky, just as it was on the night he lost his tattoo, the man decides to go and meet God. Arriving at the establishment where he met her earlier, Gu-won tells the woman that he's not going to give up on his wife and that he's going to choose the two of them. Although this seems more human than to himself, the man decides to bet on this move, and when he leaves the table, we see that his dice have come up with a pair of number ones. Afterwards, Gu-won goes to Mr. Park and gives him instructions on how to proceed with the foundation, in case the demon doesn't make it out of the situation alive. The next day, when Do-hee wakes up, she doesn't find her husband in bed, but when she goes to the balcony, she sees the man there. She was afraid he was going to leave and thought it was a dream, but was relieved when she saw him. Gu-won warns his beloved that they will have to travel at night, because today is the full moon and there is a way for the tattoo to come back to him, but the man doesn't tell her about the risks. In the next scene, we see that Suk-min is already suspicious of the fact that his son has 2 cell phones and one is always turned down. Meanwhile, Star Jean has heard from Mr. Park about the risk Gu-won will be taking tonight, and the woman decides to go to Do-hee's company to talk to her. The man is at the police station talking to the detectives. As Gu-won doesn't know if he will survive the night, he asks whoever is handling the case to protect Do-hee, as he shares the idea that the knife found in the stalker's chest is a warning to one of the couple. Returning to the protagonist, she is talking to the Star Jean and learns about the risks the two of them are going to take tonight, as well as the part where one of them has to lose their life in order for the other to live. So Jae-young gives Do-hee a poison, because if the tattoo doesn't come back while they're in the water, the woman asks the protagonist to give her life in exchange for Gu-won's. The man arrives, furious that he didn't find out about the risks from him and Gu-won. At this point, the man arrives and is furious to learn what the Jean Star is doing, after which his wife leaves upset that she didn't find out about the risks from him, and Gu-won makes it clear once and for all to Jae-young that she means nothing to him. Do-hee goes straight to Mr. Park's to confirm everything Star Jean has told her, and then goes to the lake where her husband pushed her the day after the tattoo transfer to try to get it back. There, the woman realizes why he asked her those questions the night before, so she realizes that just like her, the man must be frightened by it all. So the protagonist goes back to her apartment and tells Gu-won that they should enjoy their last day together. When the Jean Star returns to the foundation, she runs into Suk-hoon, who is there to clear up some doubts about Gu-won, and, taking advantage of how vulnerable the man is because he likes Do-hee, she comments on what the two of them are going to do tonight, not to mention the fact that the protagonist could lose her life, only for him to take her along to find out the final outcome of the situation. After spending the day together, it's almost time for them to follow in the footsteps of the day of the tattoo transfer, but on the way, the car needs to be refueled, and while they're at the gas station, Do-hee finds a postcard that she's going to take as a souvenir of the day when Gu-won will be reborn as a demon. But it turns out that the couple didn't realize that Do Jae-young had been following them the whole time, and we see why the boy has an injured arm. His father found out about the cloned phone. As I said before, the man was already suspicious about it, and to punish him, he heated an iron in the fireplace and then used it on his son's skin. What shocked me most is that Do Jae-young's mother knows about it, and, as much as it disturbs her, she puts on headphones so as not to hear her son's screams. Suk-min tells Do Jae-young that this is to fix him, so that in the future he will be a better man to take his father's place, and that to prove his potential, Suk-min wanted his son to end up with Do-hee. We can see on Do Jae-young's face that he is very upset. Meanwhile, Do-hee inside the convenience store realizes that the poison that Star Jean had gotten to her is in her pocket, and then she receives a call from Suk-hoon asking her to go away from Gu-won, but the woman quickly hangs up. She's writing on the back of the postcard when Do Jae-young starts up the vehicle and rushes into the store, while Gu-won outside runs towards his beloved. Soon Suk-hoon appears with Star Jean and an explosion occurs which results in the men being thrown backwards. Even so, Gu-won enters the convenience store and Jae-young even tries to stop him, which leads Suk-hoon to discover her true intention. Inside, the man ends up having the structure fall on top of him before he reaches the protagonist, but with what's left of his life, he uses it to drag himself to his beloved, who is lying motionless on the floor. Star Jean and Suk-hoon are in despair outside. However, after a few minutes, Gu-won appears coming out of the establishment with Do-hee in his arms, and the two are no longer injured. We then discover that the tattoo has returned to Gu-won so that he can help his beloved. At first, his bet turns out to be a good one. The next day, the couple are well and recovered from everything that happened the night before, and they even go to work in matching outfits. And before they arrive at the company, Gu-won takes his wife to the woman who would be God to show that they are both fine. Later, the gang that Gu-won became boss of against their will, got a tattoo in honor of what he named them after, and the man is in such a good mood that even that amuses him. However, something has changed inside Gu-won, because when he goes to close a contract, the man grants his wish before the gentleman signs with him. This is a man whose wife is suffering from Alzheimer's, and he really wanted her to recognize him before she passed away, because every day his wife asks to see her husband who is by her side, and because of her advanced age, she doesn't realize it's him. So when Gu-won fulfills the man's wish, he ends up getting emotional seeing the love they feel for each other, then leaves without making a deal. Back at the protagonist's company, the couple decided to investigate the people who might be the culprit who tried to take her life the day before, and, as Mrs. Shin was acting strangely, they decided to follow her. However, the two came across something even better and more surprising. They discovered that Miss Shin and Mr. Park are in a relationship, which began the day the man went to take her home after she had a few drinks with Do-hee. However, Miss Shin still wants to keep her love life a secret, so she was all spied on and awkward, so that no one would find out. We also learn that Mr. Park isn't very good at keeping secrets, as Mrs. Shin already knows the truth about Gu-won. At night, the demon once again dreams of a memory from when he was human, and we discover that the name of the woman he was in love with was Wulsum. So he decides to go after God to understand why he is still having these episodes from his past, and the woman's answer is that since they cause him pain, he must have blocked out these memories for that reason, because those who have a strong bond end up finding a way to find each other, and that fate is fated to repeat itself. We just don't know what that means yet. Meanwhile, Sukmin goes to Do-hee to offer an investment deal in her company, but she promptly denies it and, to provoke her, he hands her a photo of Madame Ju with the protagonist's parents. Sukmin comments that his mother was very close to them and that she was devastated when the woman's father stopped working for her. However, Sukmin says that the lady was very serious about Do-hee really being part of the family. And later, the protagonist tells Gu-won about how her parents' accident happened. It was the girl's 11th birthday and she was very excited to celebrate, as her father had said he was going to throw her a party she would never forget, but her parents had to leave for work on the date, even though the man had already resigned, which left little Do-hee confused. And as she really wanted her party to come soon, she hurried them home, but that's what caused his accident, the high speed of the vehicle. In this way, the protagonist blames herself somewhat for the way she acted and asks Gu-won for a hug. She reveals to the man that she remembers when he said he would go far away and tells her husband that she wishes he would never do that. In the next scene, we see Suk-hoon at the company and he is talking to the protagonist. The woman comments that earlier Suk-min had also shown up and she found it strange that he was offering her a deal, since nothing good ever comes out of that man, so her cousin offers to try and find out what he's up to. Then in the evening, Suk-hoon goes to Suk-min's house for dinner and Do Jae-young hasn't joined the family, because according to his father, the man is traveling. But digging around in the place before it's found, Suk-hoon discovers that the demon book is with Suk-min and as soon as the man arrives he makes an excuse to leave and warn Do-hee. Later, Suk-min goes to where his son is and we can see that he has his body bandaged from the damage he suffered trying to take Do-hee's life. For his father, Do Jae-young is nothing more than a piece in his game and as the man has once again failed to eliminate the woman, he tells his son as soon as he gets better to turn himself in for the crimes surrounding the family. Meanwhile, Gu-won and Do-hee are at Suk-min's house looking for the book, but instead they find the stalker's phone in Do Jae-young's room, so they decide to go after the man first. They end up being teleported to the police station, where Do Jae-young is being interrogated for turning himself in. There, Do-hee tries to get some truth out of the man, but Do Jae-young's mind is already very damaged and he starts saying things that don't make sense, showing his true state and scaring the protagonist. The next day, we see that Suk-min blames everyone but himself for his son being like that and now it's all on his wife, who he says that since she was the one who gave birth to him, she ends up bearing the burden of having created a monster. Meanwhile, Suk-hoon invites Gu-won to have a drink with him and now the two of them are getting along better. In the end, the demon even heals the broken arm that Suk-hoon had made in the explosion. Star Jean also invites Do-hee out for a drink and in her own way, indirectly apologizes for the way she acted. At night, Gu-won dreams again of the memories of his past as a human and this time, he can see the face of his beloved, which is the same as Do-hee's. And now we get to know the story of the couple that began many years ago. Gu-won's name is Lee-sun and everyone knew him as a young master, he was considered to be from a good family who even had servants. One day, while running away from his study duties, Lee-sun ended up going to a part of the village near the water and there he found a beautiful girl practicing her sword dancing. Despite not knowing her, she knows a lot about Lee-sun and as soon as his mentor approaches, the girl leaves without even telling the young master her name. However, the man's mentor knows what it is. Woolsome is very famous for her dancing talent and intellect, but she is nothing more than a maid, like an escort for men, meaning she could never get involved with someone of Lee-sun's class. However, even knowing this, Lee-sun went to the rock where he found her every day and pretended to study there so that he could watch her. The two of them only really got close when, one day, Woolsome let her shoes slip into the water and, even though it was dangerous, Lee-sun took the risk of picking them up, but ended up getting wet. So, at night, she lit a fire in the village so that he could keep warm, and then their love for each other began to blossom. Over the next few meetings, Lee-sun learned why Woolsome had come to live in his village. It turned out that the woman had refused to dance for an important person, which at the time was a reason for her to lose her life, and in order to escape from her problems, grateful to have come out alive from that situation, Woolsome decided to go to a less crowded village. Then the couple's view is invaded by several fireflies, which makes it more beautiful, and in this pleasant atmosphere, Yi-sun says that she loves Woo-sim. And although his wife feels the same way, it's forbidden for them to get married, so Woo-sim tells her that he believes love is a very dangerous feeling that could lead to their ruin. And the woman had an example of this, as Woo-sim couldn't dance for that important person because her friend had taken her own life that day, because she was in love with a nobleman she had met. But over the next few days, Yi-sun found a way for them to be together. The man brought Woo-sim a study of Catholics, where there is no class difference, but they still had to study this Western religion in secret, because if they were discovered, they could be considered criminals. So they attended meetings with a small group who were studying about, of course in hiding and with the intention of changing the world, rather than waiting for everything to happen over time. Yi-sun will try to pass the state exam. Meanwhile, the young master's mentor already knew about Woo-sim and Yi-sun, so to put an end to this forbidden love, he told the village owner about the two of them indulging in another religion, and the way he put it, it seemed that Woo-sim had bewitched Yi-sun. Returning to Woo-sim, before Yi-sun left for her exam, he gave her a necklace with a cross on it, so that she would remember him until the man returned, and the pendant was very similar to Gu-won's and the man's tattoo. Catholicism had already spread to other villages and, as a shame, people were losing their lives and families were having their houses burnt down. However, so that Yi-sun's village wouldn't be so badly affected, the head of the village decided to take the life of just one person as a lesson to the others, and the one chosen was Woo-sim. The woman was questioned about the pendant she was wearing around her neck, and she could have turned the others in, or saved herself by saying who owned it, but Woo-sim took all the blame on herself. Thus, when Yi-sun arrived back, his beloved was losing her life, and furious, with hatred taking over his heart, the man took out the swords and finished off everyone in the place. Then he took his own life, saying that if heaven was where God would be, he wouldn't want to go there, and that made him the being with powers. When she wakes up, Gu-won feels guilty and feels responsible for what happened to Do-hee in the past. Later, while they are having breakfast together, the protagonist learns that her husband dreamt about her memories as a human, but only that it involved a certain Woo-sim and nothing more. In the next scene, we see that Gu-won has gone to God, and there she tells him that faith is really very dangerous, that it may even be the most dangerous thing in the world, because it is through faith that man has become what he is today. But the worst is yet to come, and the woman recalls her words that fate always repeats itself, meaning that Gu-won could be the reason for Do-hee's destruction again. And with Mr. Park, the two come to the conclusion that Gu-won's humanization began when he met the protagonist because of the connection they had in the past, which was the reason for the imbalance of everything. Now we see Do Jae-young, who is hospitalized, receiving treatment and a sentence for the actions he took as guilty. In a meeting with his mother, the man finally understood that the woman had made him a shield so that he wouldn't suffer at the hands of her husband, and so Do Jae-young ended up like this. But now the man makes it clear that the time has come for her to pay for her sins. And later, while shopping, the news that Do Jae-young has taken his own life reaches the family. The man's mother also has marks on her arm like the ones he had. We can see this when she goes to wash her hands in the bathroom at her son's funeral. Suk-min, on the other hand, is more worried about what will be leaked to the company about why his son did it, and he asks Do-hee not to say anything. The evening will be Star Jin's last performance before she leaves the country, so the couple go along to watch, and for the first time, things go well between the three of them. In the next scene, we see when Madame Ju was alive and she confesses to the priest when she saw the devil himself right in front of her. As we already know, the woman was at the scene of Do-hee's parents' accident, but Gu-won also showed up there to offer a contract. Moving on to our protagonists, Gu-won believes that meeting Do-hee again could mean that this is his second chance, and to recreate that moment they had with fireflies 200 years ago, the man fills his office with them. The next day we can see that our couple are getting closer to each other, but something worries Gu-won, because things remind the protagonist of the tragedies in her life. For example, when she has an accident, it reminds her of what happened to her parents, and as the man wants to make her happy all the time, he decides to talk to the person who loves her most after him. Suk-hoon understands what Gu-won means when he explains the situation. The woman's cousin comments that she once told him that her happiest years were the short time she spent with her parents, so Suk-hoon believes that as Do-hee has known unhappiness in the midst of happiness, she may have become afraid of experiencing it again, so she keeps herself contained, blaming herself for everything that has happened. Meanwhile, the protagonist is in a meeting with her team deciding where her company's next event will be, and after one of them suggests that it be at Gu-won's theater, she approves the proposal. At night, Gu-won is still worried that his wife will never be able to relax during this lifetime, so he does everything in his power to make her better, like when he sees her crying during a dream, the man decides to enter it and comfort her, then he uses his powers so that at least in this fantasy world, the protagonist can have a moment with those she misses so much. The next day, we see that the star Jean is still in Korea, as she still has a few more performances in the theater, so she talks to Gu-won about it and comments again that after her commitments are over, the woman will go abroad, as it's the only way her love won't harm the man, since she has recognized that her love for him is poisonous. Later, we see Gu-won closing another contract. The demon had to find someone quickly, as a fire started in his fingers, but instead, the man found the gang that appointed him as boss, and in the end, Gu-won tells them that he is a demon. The men were surprised, but pleased to learn that he is a powerful being. Meanwhile, Do-hee receives an unpleasant phone call from Suk-min inviting her to a family dinner at his house, and even though she doesn't want to go, she accepts. In the next scene, we see Gu-won picking up the protagonist at the company so they can go home, and the man surprises her when he arrives with a beautiful bouquet of flowers that represent happiness. At the same time at Suk-min's house, his wife, who is in deep mourning for the couple's son, decides in a moment of lucidity to take the things that give her husband away as a criminal from the safe in his office, and there she comes across the demon's book. Unfortunately, not long afterwards she is caught, and of course Suk-min punishes her for it. Now on to the family dinner, starting with Gu-won, who notices that Suk-min's wife's arm is bruised when she goes to put the food on the table. And the main reason the man has invited everyone to his house is because he wants to change the way his mother handled the company, but of course with the shareholders on his tail, it will be difficult to do that. So Suk-min suggests that everyone pass on their shares so that he can have more and more power inside. Suk-hoon is the first to deny the request, and Do-hee then leaves, making his position on the matter clear, while Suk-min's sister says she'll think about it, but Suan is soon threatened by her firstborn if she doesn't accept. The next day, Suk-hoon is already beginning to see the repercussions of having denied Suk-min's request, and the employees will become temporary with the end of the work accident committee. Suk-hoon warns him about the consequences of his doing this, so Suk-min decides to fire him from his job, and a power struggle begins, which, by the way, he himself started as a joke. Then, when he leaves the company, Do-hee's cousin calls to tell him what's going on. Meanwhile, Gu-won goes back to look for the demon's book, and knowing that it was in Suk-min's house, he decides to go after the weakest end that resides there, the man's wife. It becomes even easier to deal with her when Gu-won discovers that she has been hospitalized, so the man enters the room where the woman is and tells her that he can get her out of hell if she cooperates. After some thought, Seare ends up telling Gu-won about the book and everything her husband had planned, including ordering Do-hee's death. Meanwhile, the protagonist goes to Suk-min after what her cousin had told her, and during their discussion, she realizes that Suk-min is the one who ordered the stalker, after he talks about finally getting out of the egg after his mother's death, which refers to the nickname he used to remain anonymous. When he realizes that Do-hee has told him the whole truth, Suk-min starts to get on to her. Angry, he tells her that Madame Ju was responsible for the death of the girl's parents, and, to prove it, the man reproduces a conversation his mother had with her parents before they died. Then Suk-min angrily starts to put his hands around her neck, and Do-hee only doesn't lose her life because Gu-won shows up in time to save her. The demon takes them to that tall tower he uses to find people to sign contracts, and while talking to Suk-min holding him by his tie, Gu-won tells him that at that very moment, Sara is at the police station talking about everything she knows about her husband's crimes, and then, something nobody expected happens. The man undoes the knot of his tie, and with that, he ends up falling from a considerable height. That same night, news spread that Suk-min was responsible for everything that had happened to the company and the family, along with his possible death. Even though the man's body hasn't been found, Gu-won believes that he isn't alive, as he wasn't able to use his powers to find him. When Suk-hoon arrives at the apartment, Do-hee tells him about what Suk-min had said about Madame Ju being responsible for her parents' deaths. The woman's cousin tries to calm her down by saying that Suk-min was only trying to torment her, but when he's alone with Gu-won, he's sincere when he says that if it's true, he'll destroy Do-hee. In the next scene, Suk-hoon receives an unexpected visit from the star Jean, and the two end up having lunch together. It turns out that the woman has come to him to apologize for the way she acted that day and for not revealing her real intentions. Since Suk-hoon isn't one to hold grudges and is quite understandable, the man says he'll try to understand her. Meanwhile, at Gu-won's foundation, Sara brings him the book the man was looking for, and when he asks her if what Suk-min told Do-hee was true, she replies that she didn't know anything about it, but if her husband did, it's possible that it was. At the same time, the protagonist is in her office researching her parents' accident, and when she sees a photo of Mrs. Shin standing next to Madame Ju, Do-hee decides to call her to talk about it. The protagonist discovers that her secretary doesn't know much, as she had just started at the company. However, it was at this time that Madame Ju started using a cane, even though apparently nothing had happened to her. Do-hee is increasingly confused as to whether she should go after the truth. Of course, she is terrified of discovering that the whole construction of her relationship with Madame Ju was a lie. But Gu-won is there to put the protagonist's feet on the ground, because regardless of the answer, in her last moment of pain, Madame Ju texted only Do-hee with the words that she loved her. So, reassured by this, the protagonist decides to go after the one who knows everything, the priest to whom Madame Ju went to confession. As soon as the man saw Do-hee, he seemed to know what it was all about, and also that Gu-won was the demon that Madame Ju had seen years ago. So, asking for a moment alone with Do-hee, the man tells her the truth about her parents' accident. Father Michael says that Madame Ju felt tormented until the last second of her life for not having been completely honest with the protagonist, and asked that if she couldn't find the courage to tell the truth, he should do it for her. Returning to the past, Do-hee's father went to Madame Ju after discovering that she had tampered with some tests that indicated that some people were being harmed, in fact losing their lives because of something involving the company, and the woman had done this so as not to miss out on new big offers that were to come. So the man, who didn't agree with any of it, said he was going to expose her to the world, so he got his wife together, got in a car and sped off home to see his daughter before his time ran out. However, on the way, while fighting on the road with Madame Ju, who was trying to stop the couple's vehicle, an accident happened and, moreover, 10 years ago, the man had made a contract with Gu-won, who has now returned to seek his soul. Madame Ju ended up seeing the devil, and he even offered her a contract, but from that moment on, the lady changed the way she saw life. After encountering the devil, she stopped herself from becoming one. After the protagonist leaves the church, she doesn't tell her husband what she's discovered and just pretends that Madame Ju had nothing to do with the accident, nor did he. However, the man knows something is wrong when he hears his wife crying in the bathroom, and as she won't tell him, Gu-won goes to the priest, who tells him the truth and asks him to stay away from Do-hee. When Gu-won returns home early in the morning, he doesn't find the protagonist there, so he uses his powers to be taken to her and ends up teleporting to the cemetery and hearing Do-hee talking to Madame Ju's tombstone. His wife has doubts. If the lady had told him the truth, would she have fallen in love with Gu-won? Later, Do-hee goes to her husband's foundation to talk to Mr. Park about something, and as he has a meeting about to start, she arranges to wait for him in Gu-won's office. Suddenly, a desperate woman enters the office and soon Gu-won appears, both unaware that the protagonist is there. It turns out that her contract is up and the woman would like to do another one, but there are no negotiations with the demon, so she ends up losing her life. And Do-hee is shocked to see everything, at which point she discovers that the clocks represent the contracts, so everything starts to get scarier and scarier for her, as the woman thinks that her father once had his time on one of these walls. As soon as her husband leaves the office, the protagonist takes the opportunity to leave, while Mr. Park comments to Gu-won that the woman was there waiting for him and the demon realizes what she may have seen. On the way out of the foundation, Do-hee walks away when her husband tries to approach her, and now their relationship is really shaken. At night, Gu-won is waiting for his wife in front of her company so they can talk, and in a square, the man says he will save her from hell, so the protagonist's husband disappears and Do-hee cries at his departure. Over the next few days, our protagonist is once again alone, as she was before Gu-won showed up, but now she doesn't even have Madame Ju to keep her company. At one point, Do-hee goes to the prosecutor's office to talk about the investigation into Suk-min's case, and the person assigned to take care of it was her date from the blind date that Madame Ju had arranged and that the protagonist ended up not showing up for because she had accidentally run into Gu-won. The chief prosecutor is always over the top, but he promised Do-hee that it would be a transparent investigation as she requested. Unfortunately, Suk-min's body hasn't been found yet, and until then, the protagonist isn't completely safe, although it's almost impossible for him to survive that fall. As for Gu-won's foundation, he has handed over the management of the place to Mr. Park, who, despite the fact that the demon only disappeared a few days ago, is already distraught. Gu-won also left him his necklace with the symbol of the cross, which he had been wearing since he was a young master. Looking at the accessory, Mr. Park wonders if Do-hee remembers his past life when he wears the necklace. In the director's office, the gang members also show up looking for Gu-won. They're happy to tell him about the opening of the restaurant they've set up. Now they've got a proper job, since the demon commented that they could only follow him into hell if they got one, and they're heartbroken when they find out that Gu-won has gone away for a while. In the next scene, we see Mrs. Shin talking to Mr. Park, and she comments that seeing Do-hee sad, trying to put all her focus on work, breaks her heart, but anyway the woman will try to stay strong for her to help her recover from this phase. Suk-hoon is another one who's worried about the protagonist, so he pops in at lunch and dinner times to make sure she's at least eating. In one of their conversations, Suk-hoon comments that some time ago he heard something from Madame Ju that only made sense to him now. She once said that she hadn't planned to love Do-hee so much, and that the more she loved her, the more painful it became. Now it's a week since Suk-min disappeared, and his wife is starting to get nervous, thinking that the man might still be alive somewhere. Returning to the protagonist, something strange has been happening to her. The woman is working late, so when she gets home she's very tired and sometimes even ends up sleeping on the sofa, but the next day Do-hee wakes up in her bed in her pajamas. Once, when she woke up at dawn, the woman noticed that the side where Gu-won was sleeping was warm, but when she went to call him, she found herself alone in the apartment. At that moment, the protagonist began to think that perhaps the man hadn't gone that far. The days go by, and after hearing some advice from Mrs. Shin that she shouldn't ignore her feelings, the protagonist decides to go to the foundation that belonged to Gu-won to ease her longing for him a little. However, when she opens the demon's book and the photos fall out, the ones they took in the cabin that day they were chasing Do Jae-young, tears start streaming down the protagonist's face. Mr. Park ends up bumping into Do-hee in the office, and he already knew that the woman was very sad, but when he saw her crying, the man decided that he should give the necklace that belonged to the demon to the protagonist. Later, the woman puts the accessory around her neck as she prepares to go to sleep, and as soon as she begins to dream, memories of her other life as Woo-sim return. We discover a little more about who Woo-sim was, and it turns out that when Lee-sun met her, she was about to take her own life. However, meeting this man who soon won her over, made her change her mind. Contrary to what Lee-sun thought, at no time did the woman blame him for her losing her life. In fact, Woo-sim died with the thought of gratitude for the moments they spent together, because her life wasn't very good until she met him. When she wakes up, the protagonist thinks that Gu-won might be in the place where they first met in the past, so she gets dressed, and when she gets into her car, she realizes that something is wrong when she spots a gun. It turns out that Suk-min is alive, don't ask me how, and he knocks Do-hee out. As soon as the woman wakes up, she's in an abandoned place and there Suk-min begins to hurt her in order to attract Gu-won. The demon hadn't been able to locate him through his face, because Suk-min had burned part of his face in order to stop him. The man wants to provoke the demon into taking his life and disappearing, because Suk-min thinks that this is the only way to make Do-hee suffer, and he has changed his mind about taking his wife's life. Two important things: although Suk-min is a grown man, until now he hasn't had the maturity to see that he put himself in this situation of losing everything he has, and yet the man continues to blame Do-hee, accusing her of stealing what belonged to him. Another is that according to Gu-won's manual, if he interferes in bringing someone back to life or ends up taking a person's life, the man will simply cease to exist. In the end, Suk-min's plan works and he lures Gu-won away, but in the midst of the chaos, Do-hee ends up being shot and, out of his mind, Gu-won causes Suk-min's gun to explode in his hand and injure his face. Then the demon performs its last act and brings the protagonist back to life. As a result, he disappears and once again, Do-hee is heartbroken. Even God was moved by the end of this couple. The only things left behind by our beloved Gu-won were his wedding ring and necklace, and even the clocks in the office stopped working. And as soon as the protagonist told those who knew the truth about Gu-won, everyone was inconsolable. Returning to Do-hee, she had to spend Christmas in hospital, because when Mrs. Shin and Suk-hoon found her in her apartment after breaking down the door, she was in a worrying state. As soon as she was discharged, the protagonist decided to go to the place where the tattoo had been transferred to her body, and there she prayed with all her might for Gu-won to come back to life. The woman was even willing to sign a contract, but God was pleased. And so happiness returned to her sad life. In the next scene we see them enjoying each other's company, and as soon as she remembers, Do-hee puts the wedding ring back on her lover's finger. Later, Gu-won decides to go to the person responsible for bringing him back to thank her, and he's really grateful for that. Over the next few days, we see that everyone is very happy about Gu-won's return, even Suk-hoon, who couldn't stop hugging the man. Moving on to a moment when it's just our couple, Do-hee plucks up the courage to ask about the contract Gu-won had made with her father, and we discover that when the protagonist was in her mother's womb, there was an accident and the hospital couldn't attend to her because it was too full, so the woman would lose the child and perhaps even her life. But out of her husband's desperation, Gu-won showed up and the man signed in exchange for him saving them both. Despite the end her father met, this is something that pleases Do-hee, because otherwise she would have lost her life that had just begun, and once again, Gu-won had saved her. In the next scene we see Gu-won going to the gang's restaurant and everyone is very happy to see him there. Then we move on to Do-hee, who has decided to visit Suk-min in prison, just to show that she is doing very well, and contrary to what he thinks, Gu-won is back. This further wrecks the man's psyche, which is in chaos inside and out. The protagonist leaves, after making it clear that the only thing Suk-min destroyed was himself. And finally the day has come for Star Jean to make it big outside Korea. Now she's going to the UK, and before she leaves, Gu-won makes it clear that he'll always have a place for his wife at the foundation should she want to come back. The man gave Jae-young an umbrella as a present so that she would always remember him when she used it. And before she left for the airport, the woman decided to stop by the house where she used to live when she was little. There, a little girl bumped into the Jean star and she was all bruised up, while behind her a man came running and seemed to want to scold her. Analyzing the situation, Jae-young realized that the child was going through the same thing as her when the woman was little, so Star Jean decided to take her to the police station and ended up missing her flight to be with the girl. In the next scene we see that Ms. Shin has finally decided to come clean about her relationship with Mr. Park to the people at work, and they can now finally stop pretending they didn't know. It turns out that when they went to take some fun photos, there were some of the couple on the wall, and that's how they found out. After 4 months, we see Gu-won dealing with a contract, and now with the help of Mr. Park, the man is only taking those who deserve to go to that horrible place. Back at the family cluster, Suk-hoon is the one who has taken over as president of the company, and Do-hee is very happy to see how far he has come. As for Suk-min's case, the court sentenced him to death, so the protagonist can rest assured that this ghost won't come back to haunt her. The prosecutor also tells her that Madame Ju was diagnosed with cancer before she passed away. Although she didn't tell Do-hee, the woman isn't upset and now understands why the lady was in such a hurry to marry her. The protagonist then pays a visit to Madame Ju's grave to have a chat and brings her a flower, as she was very fond of gardening. In the next scene we see the couple, and although there are fights between them, they support each other and love always prevails. What did you think of these episodes? I hope you enjoyed the summary. Leave your suggestions in the comments and subscribe. If you liked the video, like it and share it to help me out. Until next time.